Have you ever imagined living in a world without refrigerators? How did medieval people keep meat, fruits, and grains from spoiling for months or even years? Even without electricity, they developed techniques so effective that some are still used today. In this video, you'll discover incredible medieval methods, such as meat preserved in honey, fruits soaked in wine, and underground ice that lasted for years. And at the end, I'll reveal a secret about a medieval preservation method so efficient that it can still be applied today. In the Middle Ages, keeping food fresh was a real challenge. Without refrigeration, the most effective alternative was to remove moisture completely, making meat, fruits, and vegetables less susceptible to mold and bacteria. As a result, drying became one of the most common and strategic preservation methods of the time. Peasants heavily relied on this process, hanging herbs and vegetables from kitchen beams, where the fire's heat helped dehydrate them. In some regions, there were even drying towers, where warm air circulated freely, speeding up the process. For meats, strips of beef, pork, and fish were left in the sun, transforming them into early versions of what we now know as dried or cured meats. But the impact of drying went far beyond peasant kitchens. In medieval armies, soldiers depended on lightweight, durable food like dried meat and fruit to survive long military campaigns. These supplies ensured they could continue marching for months without relying on fresh food. Drying towers weren't exclusive to villages. Castles and monasteries also had dedicated spaces for dehydrating food. Monasteries, in particular, were major centers of food production and storage, and drying was essential to ensure monks had supplies all year round. Beyond practicality, drying also shaped medieval food culture. Certain recipes were developed specifically to use dried ingredients. Soups were made with dried vegetables and rehydrated meats, ensuring a nutritious meal even during the harshest winter months. Interestingly, some of these drying structures still exist in Europe, preserved as testaments to a time when food preservation was a matter of survival. Today, we still use this technique in various products, from dried fruits to dehydrated spices and cured meats. But drying was only the beginning. Some preservation techniques not only kept food from spoiling, but also transformed it entirely, such as fermentation and pickling, which we'll explore next. Fermentation and pickling, the science of medieval fermentation and preservation. If today fermented foods are considered healthy and full of probiotics, in the Middle Ages, they were a necessity. Fermenting vegetables and preserving food in vinegar were essential techniques to ensure sustenance during the colder months and to prevent diseases caused by nutritional deficiencies. Sauerkraut, for example, became a staple in Central Europe. The process was simple. Shredded cabbage was mixed with salt and left to ferment in wooden barrels for weeks or even months. The result was a food rich in lactic acid, which aided digestion and prevented scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, common among sailors and soldiers on long campaigns. Beyond sauerkraut, other vegetables like carrots, turnips, and cucumbers were preserved in vinegar or brine. Vinegar acted as a powerful antibacterial agent, preventing the growth of harmful microorganisms and extending the food's shelf life. This method was widely used in monasteries, where monks documented their experiments with different fermentation techniques, some of which are still in use today. Another fascinating example was the preservation of eggs in vinegar, a practice documented in some medieval abbeys. Monks produced thousands of pickled eggs annually, ensuring a long-lasting protein source. The vinegar dissolved part of the eggshell, but the inner membrane protected the contents, making the eggs perfectly edible for months. Fermentation wasn't limited to vegetables. Some meats and fish were fermented to develop stronger flavors and increase their shelf life. Fermented fish, for instance, was popular in some Scandinavian regions, where the natural cold slowed down spoilage and allowed the meat to mature gradually. Even without understanding microbiology, medieval people knew through experience that certain foods improved over time and became more nutritious. Today, this tradition survives. Pickles, kimchi, kombucha, and other fermented foods are consumed not only for their taste but also for their health benefits. But fermentation was just one strategy. Some noble families took preservation to an even higher level, using a powerful natural resource to keep their food fresh for years: underground ice. Natural refrigeration, underground ice houses, and medieval refrigeration. Today, we simply open a refrigerator to find fresh, well-preserved food. But in the Middle Ages, how was it possible to keep meat, dairy, and beverages cold for months without electricity? The answer lay in nature and medieval engineering. Wealthy families had access to an ingenious solution: underground ice houses. These structures were built in strategic locations, often near rivers or within dense forests where temperatures remained lower. During winter, large blocks of ice and snow were collected and stored in these chambers, insulated with straw, sawdust, and earth. The insulation was so effective that in some cases, the ice lasted for up to 2 years. Beyond castles and monasteries, some medieval towns had communal storage spaces where merchants and craftsmen could keep perishable goods. Certain monastic orders also used this technique to preserve fish and meat for longer periods, ensuring a steady food supply throughout the year. But what about those who didn't have access to an ice house? Alternative strategies were used. In mountainous regions, caves served as natural refrigerators. Villagers stored cheese, milk, and meat in cold, damp areas, slowing spoilage. In hotter areas, food was buried in clay pots underground, where temperatures were more stable. Another clever trick was evaporative cooling. In some regions, peasants used porous ceramic pots to store liquids and perishable food. Water slowly seeped through the clay's pores and evaporated, creating a cooling effect. This rudimentary technique, similar to traditional clay refrigerators still used in parts of the world today, helped keep milk fresh longer. Medieval people may not have understood the science behind these techniques, but they knew that cold preserved food and kept it edible for much longer. But when ice or natural refrigeration wasn't an option, another special ingredient, famous for its longevity and medicinal properties, came to the rescue. Honey. Honey's magical preservation. The power of honey in food preservation. Imagine a food that never spoils. Sounds impossible? Medieval people already knew that honey was one of the most powerful natural preservatives. Thanks to its antibacterial properties and low moisture content, it was used to preserve meats, fruits, and even whole birds for months or even years without refrigeration. The main reason honey worked so well was its hygroscopic nature, meaning it absorbed moisture from the environment, creating an inhospitable setting for bacteria and fungi. Additionally, its acidic pH and natural enzymes helped kill microorganisms. This is why immersing entire foods in pots of honey was a common practice in medieval households, ensuring a reliable and safe food source. But honey wasn't just a preservative. It was one of the most valuable ingredients of the Middle Ages, considered a culinary and medicinal treasure. Beekeepers were highly respected, and their production was essential for both food and medicine. Many medieval manuscripts from monasteries document remedies that combined honey with herbs to treat infections, wounds, and digestive issues. One of the most intriguing uses of honey was meat preservation. Some recipes involved coating entire cuts of meat in thick layers of honey, forming a natural oxygen barrier. The result? Meat that remained edible far longer than with any other non-refrigerated method. Historical records even suggest that certain Middle Eastern cultures used honey to embalm small animals like birds and hares before cooking them months later. Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the ancient Persians immersed bodies in honey to preserve them during long journeys, a practice that may have inspired some medieval food preservation techniques. But the ultimate proof of honey's preserving power comes from archaeology. Jars of honey found in Egyptian tombs over 3,000 years old were still perfectly edible. If honey can last that long, imagine how valuable it was in medieval Europe, where winters were harsh and food supplies were unpredictable. Beyond preservation, honey played a key role in making mead, one of the most popular alcoholic beverages in medieval Europe. Mead wasn't just a drink, it was also a way to preserve fruit, as it was often fermented with berries or apples, adding flavor and nutrients. However, not everyone had access to honey. Since it was an expensive and sought-after product, peasants had to rely on other preservation techniques. One of the most fascinating involved using alcoholic beverages as a natural preservative, which we'll explore next. Preservation through alcohol. How alcohol helped preserve food in the Middle Ages. Today we mostly use alcohol for drinking or cooking, but in the Middle Ages it was an essential tool for food preservation. Wine, beer, and even early distilled spirits were used to prevent bacterial growth and keep certain foods in good condition for much longer. Why was alcohol so effective? The answer lies in its antimicrobial properties. The alcohol content killed or inhibited the growth of microorganisms responsible for spoilage, meaning fruits, eggs, and even meats could be submerged in alcoholic liquids to slow down decay. One of the most common methods was preserving fruits in wine or strong beer. This not only extended their shelf life, but also altered their flavor, creating alcohol-infused preserves that were often served at feasts. Some noble families took this practice further by layering different fruits in large glass or ceramic jars filled with various wines, creating beautiful displays of preserved fruits. Another fascinating example was the use of alcohol to preserve eggs. Medieval monks and cooks discovered that submerging raw eggs in barrels of beer or wine prevented them from spoiling quickly. The porous eggshell allowed a small amount of alcohol to penetrate, slowing bacterial activity and keeping the eggs edible for months. But alcohol's preserving power wasn't limited to kitchens. It was also crucial for maritime expeditions. Sailors carried barrels of rum and beer to help preserve salted meat and fish. The alcohol prevented excessive moisture from ruining the supplies, ensuring crews could eat without relying on constant fishing. Beyond preservation, alcohol played a key role in medieval medicine. Herbal tinctures made with alcohol were used to disinfect wounds and treat diseases. Some fermented drinks like mead and strong cider were even recommended to boost immunity against plagues and infections. Even though medieval people didn't understand the chemistry behind these processes, they noticed that food soaked in alcohol lasted much longer than food exposed to open air. This practice has endured for centuries, and today we still see modern versions, such as rum-soaked fruitcakes and beer-washed cheeses. But if alcohol preservation was impressive, there was another ingredient even more valuable and essential for survival: salt. Without it, food supplies wouldn't have lasted nearly as long. Salted for survival. The vital role of salt in food preservation. If there was one ingredient essential for survival in the Middle Ages, it was salt. Before refrigeration, salt was the only reliable way to preserve meat and fish for extended periods. More than just a seasoning, salt was a form of currency, so valuable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid with it, giving us the word salary. Why was salt so effective? The secret lies in its ability to draw moisture out of food through osmosis, preventing the growth of bacteria that cause spoilage. Salted meats could last for months, and fish like cod and herring became essential for inland populations that didn't have access to fresh seafood. Salting techniques varied by region and salt availability. Along the coast, salted and dried cod became a major trade commodity in Europe, feeding both peasants and armies. In inland regions, meats like pork, beef, and lamb were packed into barrels of coarse salt, a process that could take days or weeks to fully remove moisture. Salt was also used to create brines, which not only preserved food but also enhanced flavors. Cheeses aged in brine became incredibly popular, while salted vegetables provided an essential alternative during harsh winters. Salt's importance was so great that entire cities formed around salt mines. One of the most famous examples is the Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, dating back to the 13th century, and still one of the most impressive salt extraction sites in the world. In some villages, entire flocks of sheep were traded just to stock up on this precious mineral. Even livestock required salt. In medieval farming, animals were given small amounts of salt to maintain their health, increasing its demand even further. Today we still use salting methods for cured meats, cheeses, and fermented vegetables. But medieval food preservation didn't stop there. Another crucial technique involved using smoke to make food last even longer. Smoky flavor and function. Preserving food through smoking. Long before refrigerators were invented, fire wasn't just a tool for cooking. It was also one of the most effective methods for preserving meat and fish. Smoking became an essential technique in the Middle Ages, helping to extend the shelf life of food while also adding flavor and depth to medieval dishes. But why did smoking work so well? The process combined two key factors: dehydration and the antimicrobial properties of smoke. Prolonged exposure to heat and smoke removed moisture from the meat, creating an environment that was inhospitable to bacteria and mold. Additionally, chemical compounds in the smoke, such as phenols and aldehydes, had natural preservative properties, preventing decomposition. Throughout medieval Europe, most homes had a dedicated smoking area. Often the process took place within the kitchen itself, where meats and sausages were hung from ceiling beams near the hearth, slowly absorbing the smoke over days or even weeks. In castles and monasteries, there were specialized smokehouses, designed to preserve large quantities of meat and fish for the winter months. The choice of wood also played a crucial role in the final flavor and quality of the preserved food. Different types of wood produced unique tastes. Oak, applewood, and cherrywood were among the most commonly used. While oak gave the food a strong, rich flavor, fruit woods like applewood added a subtle sweetness. This knowledge was refined over centuries and is still used in modern smoking techniques today. Smoking was especially important for people living in cold regions, where hunting was a primary food source. Elk, deer, and wild boar were hunted before winter, and their meat was smoked to ensure food supplies lasted through the harshest months. Fishermen also depended on this method to preserve fish like herring and salmon, keeping them edible even after long journeys at sea. Beyond necessity, smoking also became a culinary tradition. Many iconic European foods, such as smoked ham, cured sausages, and aged cheeses, originated from this medieval need to preserve food. Today, these items are consumed for their flavor rather than for survival, but the preservation techniques remain largely unchanged. However, food preservation wasn't just about fire and salt. Medieval people also mastered the use of herbs and spices, not just for seasoning, but for ensuring food lasted longer without spoiling. The role of herbs and spices in preservation, natural food preservatives. Long before herbs and spices were simply used to enhance flavor, they played a crucial role in preserving food. In the Middle Ages, certain spices not only masked the smell of aging food, but also actively prevented spoilage by inhibiting bacterial growth. Cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg were especially valued for their antimicrobial properties. These spices were imported from the East and were so rare that they were sometimes worth more than gold. In addition to being mixed into cured meats and breads, they were often added to alcoholic beverages to help extend their shelf life. More commonly available ingredients, like garlic and onions, also had antibacterial properties. They were frequently added to sausages and broths, not just for taste, but to increase their longevity. Meanwhile, herbs like rosemary, sage, and thyme did more than just flavor meat. They actively slowed the growth of mold and bacteria. Monks in medieval monasteries meticulously recorded their experiments with herbs and wine, seeking to extend food preservation and create natural remedies. Some of their herbal combinations later became the foundation for medicinal liqueurs and tinctures that are still produced today. But medieval preservation techniques didn't stop with spices and herbs. Another ingenious method involved sealing food with clay and fat to create a completely oxygen-free environment. Clay sealing and fat preservation, storing food in fat and clay. Medieval people didn't always need salt or smoke to preserve food. In many regions, they developed a simple yet highly effective method, storing food in clay pots sealed with fat or beeswax. This process created an airtight environment, preventing oxidation and dramatically slowing decomposition. One common technique involved submerging cooked meats in rendered fat and storing them in ceramic pots. As the fat cooled and solidified, it formed a protective barrier that kept air and bacteria out. This method was widely used in medieval France, where it evolved into confit, a technique still used today for preserving duck and pork. Beyond fat, clay was another effective sealant. Some rural communities coated cheese and root vegetables in layers of damp clay. As the clay dried, it created a natural protective shell that prevented insects and mold from reaching the food. Similar methods were used for storing grains and even eggs, ensuring a steady supply of food throughout the year. This principle of airtight preservation is still used today, whether in wax-coated cheeses or dry-aged meats. But food preservation wasn't just about the techniques used. The very design of medieval kitchens and food storage areas was built to maximize freshness and longevity. Medieval food storage and kitchen design. How medieval kitchens were built for food preservation. Beyond the preservation techniques themselves, the architecture of medieval kitchens played a critical role in keeping food fresh for as long as possible. Unlike modern kitchens, where refrigeration does most of the work, medieval kitchens relied on strategic design, material choices, and airflow control to extend food shelf life. Most medieval homes had an underground pantry where grains, vegetables, and cured meats were stored in a cool, dry environment. These chambers were built below ground level to take advantage of the Earth's stable temperature, keeping food away from excessive heat and humidity, which could accelerate spoilage. In castles and monasteries, kitchens were designed with large windows and roof openings to allow constant airflow. This ventilation helped prevent mold from forming on stored food, particularly grains and flour. Additionally, different types of food were stored in separate areas. Dairy products were kept in the coldest rooms, while grains were stored in wooden or ceramic containers to keep out pests. Another common feature was the use of hanging racks and suspended shelves. Meats and herbs were often hung from wooden beams, keeping them away from the floor and reducing the risk of contamination from rodents and insects. Many kitchens also had large central fireplaces, which not only provided heat for cooking, but also played a role in smoking meats and drying herbs. These architectural details ensured that families, monks, and even armies had reliable food supplies throughout the year. Now, after exploring all these fascinating techniques, It's time to reveal the secret method promised at the beginning of the video. A medieval food preservation technique so effective that it is still used today. The big reveal, the medieval preservation method that still works today. Throughout this video, we've seen how medieval people mastered food preservation without refrigeration. But among all these techniques, one has truly stood the test of time and is still used today: meat preservation in rendered fat. This simple yet highly effective method involves cooking meat in its own fat and then storing it completely submerged in the melted fat. As the fat cools and solidifies, it creates an airtight seal that prevents bacteria from growing, keeping the meat edible for months or even years. In France, this technique evolved into the well-known confit, which is still used to preserve duck and pork today. But variations of this method are found worldwide, especially in rural areas where refrigeration is limited. If a medieval peasant could walk into a modern kitchen and see a jar of meat preserved in fat, they would immediately recognize the technique. Some traditions never fade, proving that medieval people knew more about food preservation than we often give them credit for.